Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited to have you all here today. My name is Kim Igwe and I work as BranchEd's Professional Learning Manager. We'd love to know who you are. In the chat, if you can put your name and where you're joining from. +1 if you give us a weather update. I'm so curious what the weather is across the United States and beyond. We are having a very spring-like day here in Charlotte, North Carolina. So we'd love to know, we are so excited to have you today and would love to know who's joining us. So in the chat, if you can put your name and where you're joining from. We will get started in just a moment as we get the LinkedIn live stream going. Jesse, very early morning for you today. Thank you for joining us. Please do introduce yourself in the chat as you join, and we will get started here in just a moment. We are thrilled for today's session, webinar, Preparing Future Teachers for an AI World. Thank you so much for being here today, and we will get started. For those of you who are new to BranchEd, we are a professional services organization and a collective of education leaders advancing educational excellence by expanding individual capacity, enabling supportive relationships, boosting institutional effectiveness in the classroom in both school districts and higher educational institutions, and collaborating with communities. We believe that every student deserves access to caring, adaptive, and well-prepared teachers, that every teacher deserves preparation that fuses quality with diversity, and that every person benefits when we create a higher standard of education together. Thank you for being here today. I see we have folks joining from all over the US, and we are just thrilled to have you all here today for this conversation. This is the 7th of BranchEd's 2025-2026 Nuts and Bolts webinar series. Throughout this year of learning, we will empower educators to innovate with purpose, thoughtfully bridging pedagogy and possibility. From integrating new instructional approaches to deepening content expertise and harnessing the power of storytelling, educators will engage with forward-thinking yet practical strategies. As we navigate the evolving role of AI in education, we will emphasize the humanity of teaching, honoring the expertise, creativity, and contributions of both teachers and learners. Before I get started, I want to share a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar and it will be shared. We're also LinkedIn live streaming it, so please share with colleagues and friends. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar, so please either use the chat or you can use the Q&A, whatever works for you, to put those questions in. And we are just so thrilled to have you here today, and we will use the chat to share some resources at the end, so keep an eye on that chat. And now I'd love to introduce our featured panelists. Jesse Dukes is a journalist and audio producer whose work focuses on storytelling at the intersection of education and technology. He is the co-host of the Homework Machine, a podcast examining how artificial intelligence is reshaping teaching and learning experiences in real time. Jesse brings experience in narrative audio production and reporting using long-form storytelling to explore complex topics in accessible ways. Through his work on the Homework Machine, he highlights perspectives from educators and students navigating the rapid integration of AI into classroom. His work centers on making emerging trends in education technology understandable and relevant, while raising questions about the equity, instructional design, and future of learning. Justin Reich is an educator, researcher, author, and professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he serves as an associate professor of digital media and comparative media studies and writing, and directs the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. His work focuses on the future of learning in a networked world, with particular attention to how technology shapes teaching, teacher learning, and educational systems. Justin is the author of Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, and Iterate: The Secret to Innovation in Schools. He co-hosts the Homework Machine podcast with Jesse. His research and writing have appeared in leading academic journals and public outlets such as Science, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post, reflecting his commitment to making complex ideas about education and technology accessible to broader audiences. Thank you both for being here. As I mentioned in both of their bios, they are the co-hosts of the Homework Machine, which is a mini series in the Teach Lab podcast. So Jesse and Justin share stories of teachers and students reacting to an arrival of an exciting, alarming, and strange new technology that is AI. Thank you both for being here today. We are just so excited to have you. We are excited to learn about the podcast and what you have learned about the podcast through doing it. And I'm excited to have you on the other side of the podcast and revealing more about the podcast from the other side. So thanks for being on the other side of the mic with us today. Justin, I'd love for you to start us off because your research is broad and you've been a longtime researcher in education technology. And in the podcast, and the first episode, you say education technology often over promises and under delivers. How does AI compare to previous waves of ed tech innovation?
Well, first of all, Kim, thank you so much for having me. And probably the first most important answer is that we don't know yet. I start though with the guess that new technologies in education are fundamentally similar in a few ways. So, like, here are three bets that I make with every generation of education technology, and I expect to make for the next 2 decades. So first, when teachers get access to new technologies, they use it to extend existing practices. So people often say, "Oh man, this new thing that we built, it's going to make teaching totally different." And it's like, nope, people are going to take a new thing and use it to do the exact same thing that they were doing before. So we used to we just used to read aloud lecture notes, and then we wrote them on chalkboards, then we wrote them on whiteboards, and we put them on acetate sheets, and we put them on PowerPoint slides, we put them on smart boards. But it's the same lecture notes. Huge swaths of education technology are just digital worksheets, and don't even really operate that differently from worksheets in a whole bunch of ways. And if you want to, you could be critical of that pattern, but it actually doesn't matter if you're critical of it because it's what happens. And so we have to design professional development interventions, new technologies for the schools that actually exist, not the schools that we wish exist. The second thing that we'll see is that new technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent. So new technologies disproportionately benefit people with the financial, social, and technical capital to take advantage of new innovation. So where you do see sort of pockets of most exciting practice, they disproportionately happen in the service of people who already have a lot of resources. And then the third kind of, pretty good bet, I would say, is that new technologies are only as powerful as the communities that guide their use. So folks in Silicon Valley always want to invent a thing that you just download onto your computer or you buy and put in your classroom, and it makes learning different. And that basically never happens. The only time we see benefits from new technologies is when teachers have what usually takes years of coaching and professional learning opportunities and collaborative planning time and practice and experimentation and feedback, where students learn new routines, where parents learn new routines. Basically, the whole community has to get better at a whole set of new routines, not just downloading software onto people's machines. So those three ideas, that we typically extend existing practices, that we benefit the affluent with new technologies, and that when we do something better than normal, it's because we've built the capacity of a whole community, not downloaded a thing. Like, those, I think, are going to prove true for GPTs and agentic AI and whatever other next thing somebody comes up with that they want to tell us is going to transform education.
Justin, thank you so much. The fact that you said acetate paper took me back to, I think, seventh grade biology.
Nice.
I was taken back there for a moment. I mean, the real history of it, right? And how lots have changed, and actually the core of it has not changed. Thank you for sharing that. Jesse, I know with the podcast, you all interviewed 80 plus teachers, I believe, and 30 plus students. I've really enjoyed hearing from those teachers and students um, on the podcast and their experiences. Um, in their experiences and what you've been hearing from them, how does this moment feel different from past technologies? So I know Justin just talked about the adoption of technologies. How does this one feel different for them, or does it feel different than past technologies they were asked to adopt?
One huge difference is it wasn't so much that they were asked to adopt it, it's that they were forced to adapt to it. Um, this is not entirely new. Justin and I sort of arrived at this concept of an arrival technology, which is an education technology that's going to be present in school environments, irrespective of policy. So, an early example of that might be the calculator, pocket calculator, which schools did adopt, but also we know that students used calculator to bypass intended learning. And that at some point, by the 1980s, when I was in school, most students could afford a pocket calculator at home, and they might be powerfully tempted to use it on their homework and that sort of thing. There's an analogy to that. There's an analogy to things like, Wikipedia and Cliff Notes, so resources where students can quickly get information that their teacher might be asking them to produce on their own. But this just tremendous potential for what we might call cheating or bypassing the intending learning. I don't know. Justin's really more the historian here than I am, but that's huge. And I would say at least two-thirds of the teachers we spoke to mentioned that as a concern. Sometimes it was a minor concern. Sometimes they felt like they had it under control. Sometimes it was their biggest concern. But that was sort of universal. And because AI is something that most students have access to. Like 95% of teenagers have smartphones. You can get AI on a smartphone. A high percentage of teenagers have laptops at home. Many teenagers have figured out how to access ChatGPT and other AI on their school computers that have been issued to them at school. You just have almost all students have access to this technology that can complete many, many, many standard homework assignments. And so that just forces an adaptation. Teachers have to think through, what am I going to do about these homework assignments that I've relied on for years or for decades, because I know that my students, these assignments are going to press my students to think in a way that I want them to think, so they'll learn. Well, maybe that's not true anymore. And I think that's the huge difference. I think another big difference, and again, this is probably just an amplification of things that have happened in the past, is that AI in general is just a cultural moment. We are hearing people tell us that AI is going to change the world for the better. We're hearing people who are telling us that it's going to destroy the world. We are hearing people tell us that it's bad for the environment. Many school districts and superintendents and school leaders are hearing that they should be adopting AI so their students will know how to use it in order to take advantage of the huge affordances that AI may or may not bring to the classroom. So there's also just a lot of confusing, conflicting information out there right now, and we're in a cultural moment, and all of this is sort of settling onto teachers in the last few years.
Thank you, Jesse. It's such an interesting in the way AI came to teachers through students' use of AI, which I think the interviews really highlight that
Yeah.
teachers are responding to something that they weren't given by the district per se, but that the kids are using, and so it's super just an interesting look at how we are responding to it. Justin, in your research, you've shown that the many ed tech tools don't transform learning the way we expect. What patterns from the past are you already or are you seeing repeat with AI?
Yeah, so first, that new technologies don't disrupt education systems. There's a sort of constant hope.
Right.
Just in my own lifetime, it's been social media and web 2.0, one laptop per child, social media, massive open online courses, now AI, although it goes back 100 years. I mean, Thomas Edison said that in 1913 that within 10 years, text would be completely removed from schools because text was only 2% efficient, and these new film strips that he had just invented were 100% efficient. He actually then 10 years later went in front of Congress and said in 20 years, all of the text would be replaced by film strips. So, this is a really common hope, and it doesn't happen. So, we're nearly 4 years into the GPT era, and walk to your local public school, secondary school, and a lot of things are going to look awfully similar. What does happen is that teachers find ways of taking new technologies and using them to try to solve very particular problems where they sometimes can be helpful, although also a lot of times the juice ends up being not worth the squeeze. That you sort of go through all of this rigmarole, and you're like, that's not really that much better than what I was doing before. Or when we look at long-term outcomes, we look at test score changes, when we look at graduation rates and things like that, it's really hard to see the particular benefits of technologies, especially in the things that we measure. I mean, in the United States education system, we basically measure reading, certain parts of math, and graduation is kind of a nebulous requirement. We don't really measure like how good people are using computers to solve problems in their lives. So it could be that we're teaching that, but we don't really know it because we don't really have a good way of measuring those kinds of things. So I think again, those are the kinds of patterns that are holding. In lot to me, sometimes it's surprising how we end up saying the same things over and over again without remembering how we said them before. So there's this sort of line like, man, this is going to make teaching so much more efficient. I mean, that is what we have been talking about with computers and the web for 2 decades. But like, go to your local public school, find the most grizzled veteran teacher you can find, who's been there 15, 20, 25 years, and ask that person, are you spending more time on the most important parts of teaching because of all of the technology you've accumulated in your classroom over the last 20, 25 years? And I don't think there are many grizzled veteran teachers who will be like, oh yeah, man, this job used to be really hard, tons of paperwork, but now it's a breeze. I mean, in some respects, the opposite has happened. And I don't think, we're going to find targeted ways that introducing students to different kinds of artificial intelligence tools are really cool, are fun, are surprising, are weird, are helpful. We are not going to find that they lead to some kind of major step change in people's learning. And actually, like the earliest studies that come out sort of confirm that. There's a neat study between a virtual tutoring provider and Google DeepMind, where they had DeepMind, their GPT product, giving tutors sort of like coaching and ideas about how to tutor their teachers. And it improved things, but like basically an infinitesimal amount, like a very, very small gain, which is not uncommon in education. Like most of the things we try in education, in mathematical terms, they have like a zero point 0.1, zero point 0.2 effect size. They move a group of students who would have been at the 50th percentile to the 54th percentile, the 58th percentile. Like, education is a game of inches. And so if we can get small gains from these things, I'm all for it. I think one of the things I'm most trying to caution schools about is like, it's probably not worth going all in, kind of making crazy investments or crazy changes on the basis of these new tools, until we really figure them out, because they're just like, there's nothing else that we've tried in the last 100 years that if you really dive in early, you see huge transformative gains from your students. There's a lot of challenges that schools have. AI is not the only, chronic absenteeism remains a major challenge. Poverty and hunger in our schools remain major challenges. Having teacher well-being, feeling like they're valued parts of the community, like those are real challenges, and they're very much worth attending to.
And thank you, Justin. I'm just sitting on all the goodness you shared in your wisdom and your research over technology over the years. I'm curious, and Jesse, I know you talk to a lot of folks, and I'm going to take us off the rails just a little bit. Like the impact, I would love, and I think folks are wondering this as well. Like, tell us a little bit about the background of those folks. Were they early age, secondary? What like, and um how the shift of AI coming at them did that perspective change based on the grade of kids they taught, right? Like whether they were veterans or whether they were new to the classroom, right? So like AI was pushed on them,
Yep.
and we established that, right? Like it was pushed on them, but I'm curious how that impact was different based on how many years they've been in the classroom, what grade. Like I wouldn't imagine a kindergartner is
No.
using ChatGPT, right? Versus a secondary AP English class, right?
Right.
So like, can you sort of speak to the nuances of what you were hearing from teachers and students?
Almost all the teachers we spoke to were secondary, so kind of like sixth grade and up. And we did chat with some elementary teachers who basically said it wasn't a thing because kids don't have computers
Yep.
and they don't have smartphones until middle school, which is a funny thing to remember that like you had to learn how to use a computer and a smartphone, but that's actually something that kids start transitioning into middle school. So if you don't have those devices, you're probably not going to use AI. One interesting aside, though, is that there are companies trying to provide AI-powered educational software, and we did spend a few days with a school that's trying some of that with elementary students. That's pretty interesting. So mostly we talked with high school and middle school teachers and students. We really tried for geographical diversity. We've tried for racial and ethnic diversity. We tried for diversity of kind of resource profiles, urban, rural, suburban um, patterns. I think the pattern I could say is that the expectation is often that older teachers are going to be less inclined to adopt new technology, and younger teachers might be more inclined. I didn't necessarily see that as a pattern. I definitely think there are teachers who are more inclined and more excited about AI and ChatGPT and experimenting. They tended to be veteran teachers. They tended to be veteran teachers who had kind of figured out the basics of how they teach and felt like they had the brain space and the energy to experiment a little bit. So new teachers weren't necessarily experimenting a whole lot with the tools. They were mostly sort of figuring out how in the heck do I keep my students from using this to bypass the learning gains that I want. We definitely saw a pattern of English and language arts teachers being more concerned. I think in particular, when you talk about a machine that can write an essay, English language arts writing teachers are really used to using writing to understand how their students are thinking. And they
Right.
tend to see a deep connection between thinking and writing. Whereas, like a computer science professor, teacher, computer science teacher, science teacher, biology teacher might see writing as more the way that you communicate what you've learned. So the idea that you would automate the writing doesn't necessarily see as scary to them. So that was a pattern. Maybe more STEM teachers kind of experimenting with using ChatGPT and other tools. I mean, I think the other thing I'll say is that it just varied widely by school and by school district, and there were some patterns, but there were schools where in 2022 and 2023 the teachers and might have had no idea that AI existed, generative AI existed. We got stories from students about using AI to do an assignment and their teachers not knowing what that was, like in the spring of 2023 or something like that. Another story from Westwood, Massachusetts was like the moment that ChatGPT became available, he sent, this is a technology director. He heard about it through some email chain. He sent an email to his superintendent, and over the weekend they wrote a memo, and they had professional development and training and like what is AI available for their teachers like the next week, and some policies and expectations in place for their students like the next week, like November 2022. There were plenty of school districts who didn't have anything like that in place. In the fall of 2024. In fact, only something like 25% of teachers said that there had been any policies put in place in the fall of 2024. So it varied widely. One of my favorite stories about this is we spoke to I want to say an 8th grade social studies teacher who took 2 years off from I think basically 2021 to 2023. So came back in the fall of 2023, and her students were all using Bing on their like issued Chromebooks or laptops. And she said, "Why are they using Bing? Nobody uses Bing. They're using Bing. It's a search engine that nobody uses. Everybody uses Google." and they're using the Edge browser, which comes with Microsoft. And it turns out that Bing at the time offered a free version of ChatGPT that the students could use. So they were copying questions they were getting in class into AI, and she figured this out in a few weeks. But there was this just, she'd been gone for 2 years, and there was this whole new classroom practice that the students were bringing into that class. And it was surreal in that particular case.
Jesse, I vividly remember listening to that because I had my seventh grade son in the car, and he was like, "Oh, those kids are smart." He was like, "Kids will find a way," and I was like, "They do always find a way." Which gets to this question, and I was a former eighth grade ELA teacher for 10 years, so this really does hit to my heart. That episode, that conversation around um around what kids are putting in. We as ELA teachers know how our kids talk, right? How they respond to text when we're having those conversations. And what I really gathered from that conversation is teachers are concerned about students using AI and can identify that's not my student's voice, or my student has never used that word in their life. Like, yeah, do you know? And I even remember one teacher asking the student, tell me what that word means. And they could not tell them what the word means. So it does sound like there's a lot of investigation and a lot of, at least during that time period, of the onus being on the teacher to investigate of like, where is this coming from? Is this actually your writing? Is this ChatGPT writing? And where is the line of like, can you gather ideas from ChatGPT, but then you have to write it on your own? Like, and so what are, I guess where I'm going with this question is like, is that a main concern for teachers really was around ensuring that they're getting actual authentic student learning and writing and responses? Is that one of their main concerns that they're seeing in the classroom?
I think it's the biggest concern that was raised. A secondary concern is how can we take advantage of some of the benefits of this technology? But if you're worried about your kids not learning and cheating, and also you're already a beleaguered teacher with 35 students, in an underfunded school or something like that, you don't necessarily really have time to. At one teacher told me that's a summer problem. Thinking out how we might use ChatGPT to help what we're doing. That's a summer problem when we have a little bit of time on our hands. But if you think your students are turning in work that's not their own thinking, that's an immediate problem. And when we did the interviews, lots of teachers were in the thick of that, and they were working it out. I think that, what all of the teachers have in common is that because this technology is foisted upon them in various ways, they're forced to go through a thought process that might actually be this might be a silver lining. It might be kind of useful and productive, which is I've been giving my students this particular assignment for years now. Maybe it's write this particular essay about the Great Gatsby, let's say. Now they could ask ChatGPT to write that essay. So I've been giving this assignment. I like it. I think it gets them thinking in interesting ways. But what thinking are they actually doing that I like as a teacher? And what parts of that might be okay to automate a little bit? And so I do think a lot of teachers had to start thinking about, like, okay, if they're going to use AI sometimes, how is that different from asking a parent for suggestions? How is that different from, reading another essay on this particular book? Most teachers allow their students to access some kind of resources when they're doing independent homework. And, ChatGPT, Gemini, AI can provide all sorts of levels of scaffolding and resource depending on how you tune it. So I think they were all kind of forced to ask that question. And then they were forced to think, like, is there some way I can try to get my students to learn what they want to learn, either by integrating AI into the process? Maybe I can invite them to have a discussion with AI and turn in the discussion. Or maybe I can use an AI filter to make sure, or an AI checker, something like Turnitin, to make sure that they are not using AI when, I'll assign them an essay and I'll tell them they need to write it themselves, and then I'll try to monitor that either by what you were kind of referring to earlier, Kim, with just knowing their student's voice, but also using these AI detection software. A lot of teachers, and I think this is actually, my sense is this is happening more and more, are kind of going analog. And so if we're talking about high school and we're talking about, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade English or social studies, where they really want to see their students writing and thinking, they're having them do it on blue books, or composition notebooks, handwrite in class, often where they can watch. And I think there was even kind of like a run on blue books at one point. So we've heard anecdotally that many teachers are choosing a very analog solution. That they're basically choosing to create a space where they are pretty sure that the writing they're seeing from their students is their students' original work and their original thinking. But there are other teachers who are kind of playing around a little bit more with like, can I get, is there some way I can integrate AI into this process such that I still preserve what I really want my students to be learning in this particular moment as well. I think the last thing I'll say about that is like, definitely teachers describe a lot of cat and mouse, a lot of time and energy, attention trying to discern whether or not the particular bit of work in front of them is their student's original work or not. And that takes a lot of time, and that's time they could be spent doing something else productive, in terms of engaging with their students, helping them in some way. And our sense is that that's actually been a huge problem for a lot of teachers. Although, I would also say that a lot of the teachers have started to figure out strategies for countering that.
I'll add two things from my experience. Um, I teach classes at MIT. So I teach pretty smart, weird kids, but some of it is like anywhere else. Um, and we did some assignments this fall where I either allowed them or required them to use GPTs. And one of my main observations was I had never been so excited to see students write down things that were wrong. Because when what they wrote was wrong, I could go, this is like you've made a mistake. I can fix this mistake. I can help you. I can clarify your understanding. But then I realized that when they wrote things that were right, I wasn't sure that they understood it, particularly compared to sort of like previous essays assignments when people wrote things that made sense. I had a pretty good bet that they actually understood it. I had much lower confidence when students were writing things that made sense. And I didn't know what to do about that. Like, do you follow up the writing assignment with an oral exam? Like you sort of keep assessing students over and over again on the same kinds of things. It also made me think a lot about trust. Um, there's, one there, I think a lot of trust issues come up with things like, did the student misrepresent their own work? Did they use GPT when they shouldn't have? And that's one kind of trust. Another kind of trust is just, does this person's words represent their understanding? And is it clear to me in a number of cases that it didn't, that they were words they had gotten from a machine, but didn't really understand and make sense of. When some people talk about using ChatGPT or other things to be more efficient in schools, I sort of envision them imagining schools like as places where like a bunch of people are shoveling coal into boilers. Like you just have to make them like shovel the coal faster and then the boiler gets hotter. But that's really not how schools work at all. Schools are social systems. Like almost everything that we do in schools is an act of communication from one person to another. And the most powerful tool we have for efficient social systems, efficient communications is trust. So here's this machine which to some extent, like it induces people to misrepresent themselves by giving them words that they use not as their own. And I think those sort of consequences, those assaults on trust are going to be challenges that we wrestle with for a long time.
It's a great point. I mean, just having kids myself and seeing them, kids will want to get there the quickest, right? That is how they developmentally, I think many children think, like, how can I get to the answer as fast as possible? And can AI get me there faster? I often see my second grader, she just wants to beat everyone, right? Like, I'm going to read it as fast as possible, but I might not be able to tell you what I just read because my goal was not to comprehend it. My goal was to beat you in my fluency, read it as fast as possible. And so, an AI feeds them that, right? It feeds the efficiency or the speed right? But it doesn't nod to the learning. And so, Justin, like, how do teachers how do they negotiate that in that it's not always nodding to the learning, it's nodding to it's optimizing how quickly can I get there?
Yeah, I mean, Jesse's got a nice framework of what people try. Like, definitely pleading is a big part of my repertoire now, more so than it used to be. Um, where I just, I say to students, like, I can help you become a better thinker. I can help you become a better communicator. I can help you become a better writer, but only if we're talking about your words. I, ca- if the, the more I don't know that I can help you if you're using a machine. Um, I'm, I'm going to throw some shame in there. Next year, I had a student who completely who a big part of my class is reading this book I wrote called Failure to Disrupt. And a student in a paper had a quotation, had sort of a summary, a paraphrasing of the book, which was like not at all like anything I said. And I'm the author of the book, so I'm like pretty confident in this misinterpretation. And then I'm talking with him, and he says, I swear up and down I didn't use AI to write this paper. And I'm like, he's a nice guy, I believe him, sure. And I was like, I did though, like put a bunch of reading notes in there, or I did ask it a bunch of questions about your book. And I was like, oh yeah, like it told you things that were not at all true. And so what I'm planning to do when I teach this class again this fall is just recount that conversation to my new group of students and say like, like we're going to become friends over the course of this semester. Do you have any idea what it would feel like for you to have to sit down next to me and have me explain to you that like you paraphrased a part of my book which does not exist? Like that will be terribly humiliating and sad for you, and you want to avoid that. So this is what Jesse calls monitor and communicate. My version of monitor and communication involves a lot of pleading. And then there are these kinds of detect and consequences. You come up with some kind of system to catch students, which I think you'll find lots of higher education professors don't do this because we can just say, look, our kids are paying to be here. And if they pay to waste their time, they can feel free to waste their time. I don't think that's a good idea for public educators who have a mission to educate every kid in the community's interest. And then Jesse brings up this third one of trying to make assignments where it's really hard to use AI or it's simpler to do what people want. I just will say that like it sounds like a great idea. I was just reading something from Chris Lehman, who's the principal of Science Leadership Academy, which I think is like the very best project-based learning school in the country, maybe along with High Tech High. And he has an extraordinary staff, lots of veteran teachers, lots of like this is the best possible place that you could work. And he's like, we can't AI prove everything. If like like it's just like I mean I would he and his team are the best people in the world to try to do this, and they're telling us they can't do it. That you can't have people do the kind of intellectual exercises we've had before, and say we're only going to give students things that AI can't do. So there are some real challenges out there that I mean, another message that I'm trying to send to educators, and Jesse and I are trying to send to educators, is that like these problems are not solved yet. Teachers have this wonderful quality of seeking out best practices. Like you encounter a problem and you say, who has figured out how to solve that? And in lots of things, it's really good. Like if your students are having a hard time reading, do not reinvent reading instruction from first principles. Like do not reinvent reading instruction in your classroom. Like we have decades and decades of research on how to do that. Unfortunately, that like very good instinct doesn't work very well for brand new technologies. Like we simply don't know. Jesse and I are documenting a series of strategies, but we couldn't possibly tell you which of them are working and which of them are not. And in some cases, it's really going to take us many years to know, like, okay, for the sixth graders who are like totally immersed in AI forward assignments, are they better off, in 2040 than the students who, were handed blue books and, kept in more traditional environments for longer? Like, it takes a long time to figure these kinds of things out.
It makes me wonder, we spent a lot of time talking about chat, all the GPTs and how kids are using them. Jesse, was there other moments that you could speak to of kids using AI in more creative ways or in like expanding their learning beyond that AI particularly?
Yeah. Um, we spoke to a lot of students, and there were a few who told us instances of just really straight up using ChatGPT or something like that to get something done quickly in a way that their teacher would not approve of. And then there were a number whose either their teacher encouraged them to use AI, or there was one case of a student named Cameron who was feeling some anxiety about a writing assignment, kind of like writer's block, basically, and went to a teacher who she had a really strong relationship with and said, "Hey, I want to use AI to help me get over my writer's block. I still want to do the writing myself." Um, and so they had a conversation and they came up with a way that she could use AI to kind of get started on this assignment. And she kind of documented how she used it. So she documented the prompts she got and the responses she got to the response. And then, essentially the AI gave her an outline for a short story that she then wrote. And she could have cut the edges of that a little bit. She could have used the AI to generate more than just the outline, but she liked this teacher. They had a good relationship. They had a trusting relationship. So she says she kind of stuck to the agreement that they made. That's one pretty good example. I feel like you hear a lot of great examples of college students using AI as a study aid. I talked to a couple students who had examples of that, basically using it like a really powerful search engine when they're trying to learn some concept or not. Tends to be pretty high level students who can do that. And I mean upper grades, also kind of like academically successful, motivated students who could do it. Um, what I also was really struck by is a tremendous gray area that students report, where there are ways in which they want to use AI for some kind of support on an assignment they're working on, and they're not really sure whether their teacher would approve of that or not. And many of them said, in that situation, a lot of times we'll just do it, and because it's not technically been banned. And maybe there's a lack of clarity between, in terms of what counts as cheating and what doesn't. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I can think of a good example of this. There was a student who found an assignment really, really boring. It was writing some summaries of something she had read for an environmental science class, and she actually told us that she had homework for another class that she liked more that she wanted to do. So she used AI to write drafts of these summaries of some articles. Then she went through and read the drafts and edited them, and that was kind of the way that she was able to tell herself that it wasn't cheating. Like, she created a kind of narrative justification for doing something that a teacher might have considered cheating. But she told us she thought it was busy work. She thought it was a boring assignment. And she thought that she wasn't learning a whole lot by doing it. And she didn't ask her teacher for permission, but she also, I think that she operated in a kind of vacuum of clear expectations, such that she could kind of tell a story in which she was not actually cheating or violating trust, but simply using AI in a clever way to support her learning. So those gray areas are super, super common. And as of 2 years ago, schools and teachers were not necessarily being very clear with their students about what would constitute cheating, what would constitute a responsible use of AI, and different teachers have different ideas about that. We had one teacher actually. He teaches film. His students make films, and he was very comfortable with his students using AI in just about any way that they could think of, because he didn't think the AI tools were so powerful that they would really prevent the students from eventually having to really learn some key storytelling and filmmaking principles. And so he would sometimes even encourage them. Oh, you don't know what questions that you're doing a documentary, you don't know what questions to ask your source? Ask ChatGPT for some questions, and then let's talk about them together. He was very comfortable with that. A lot of teachers would not be comfortable with that. And the students report some confusion because there's just a tremendous variation in their teachers' attitudes about the use of AI.
One thing you mentioned at the top of this conversation that I feel like Jesse had just threaded through again for me is this that ed tech has it can lean into widening a gap versus closing a gap, right? So I just heard Jesse say the high level students could really engage with it in a way creatively. They could like find around it. Justin, I heard you say at the beginning, like the folks who have wealth, I'm not going to quote you exact, but like they're going to have access as early as they want and they're able to play with it as much as they want. And I also hear like the idea of going analog, that's a choice, right? That some folks will have and some folks won't have. I just like as we see districts saying no, you can only take your state test on the computer. There's no other, like so in playing with that sort of theme around education technology and the widening of the gap or the closing of the gap. Justin, where's your thoughts around AI in where it was 2 years ago, where it is now, what schools are doing with it? Like where how do you see it within that playing of how it's going to benefit all or benefit some or hurt some or hurt all, right? Like where do you see that playing out for AI?
Historically, education technologies benefit affluent people. And there are case studies of things that people have built that do the opposite, that disproportionately benefit people furthest from opportunity. There's a program at Rice University called OpenStax, which makes free, openly licensed, freely accessible textbooks targeted at community college students. So for a student who's paying tens of thousands of dollars to go to a flagship school, your $150 textbook is like a relatively small drop in the bucket to all costs. If the costs of a course are $250 for the credit hour and $250 for the textbook, then the textbook is like a pretty big cost. And these guys found a fabulous way to make really high quality materials that were totally available for free. There are a couple of other assessments is this online practice problem tool for mathematics, which helps all students learn mathematics, but disproportionately helps students who are furthest from opportunity have lower prior performance. So there are these case studies of things that exist, and the science and theory about how you do more stuff like that is not good at all. We basically don't understand how to build these kinds of things. You might think like, oh, well, OpenStax is free. That's why it helps. And you're like, well, but there are lots of other, massive open online courses are free and they are primarily used by people to get their second master's degree. Like they're mostly useful for already educated, already affluent people. So we don't have the way I'd say is we don't have a science of how you design technologies to benefit people equally or to sort of benefit people at the margins the most. Um, you know, uh, what I could imagine two scenarios. Well, the thing which is assured to happen is that people who are in more affluent schools are going to, I mean, here are the two things that happen all the time is that affluent people, kids in affluent neighborhoods, have more adult mentorship and support, and they are asked to use technologies in more complex ways. So you can go back to surveys from the 90s where people will tell you that when desktop computers showed up, kids in poor neighborhoods use them for drill and practice, and kids in affluent neighborhood use them for simulations and games and programming and creative things, and they had more adults to help them. That assuredly will be the case with generative AI. I mean, the only way that the spread of generative AI could sort of reduce inequality is if it proves to ultimately be really bad for learning. Like if the sort of net effect is this is just a sort of toxin spreading through our schools and that rich people have more access to the toxin than poor people, then that would have the unfortunate effect of bringing things together. But I think we'll see what we see in other cases, which is where sort of unsupervised, unsupported use of the technology is not very helpful. But if you have a lot of resources, a lot of support, I mean, the other kind of weird thing about GPTs, generative AI, that might be different from other technologies is it really is, I don't know if this is true. My hypothesis is that it's more helpful to experts than to novices. So it's not that difficult to make AI say stuff. What is really difficult is discerning the quality of output. And there's no special skill that you learn to discern the quality of output. You just need domain expertise in whatever you're asking about. So when I ask GPT about education technology, I'm really good at identifying when it comes up with clever, interesting responses and when it comes up with bad responses. My students are really bad at that because my students are novices at examining education technology. And so they ask GPT to summarize articles and it does it completely wrong and they have no idea. So it could be a kind of technology, perhaps more uniquely, that like essentially the more well-educated you are and the more educational support you have, the more useful it is for you. Because if you're in an environment where you can develop that domain expertise, then you can be like, oh man, this thing is really giving me some helpful answers, and it's also giving me some dumb ones, but I know to ignore those. Where if you're in an environment where you don't have great educational supports, where you don't have great access to opportunities for learning, then you don't develop the domain expertise that makes AI a potentially useful partner.
Thank you. Super. Thank you. We are now at the time for some questions from the audience. So I'm going to share some of those questions. And if folks have more questions, please do put them in the chat or the Q&A, whichever works for you. Ferdy has asked a question. What are 2 to 3 things that AI can do effectively to support actual teaching, not including lesson planning or UDL to write different lesson plans? I want something that we know chatbots can do exceptionally well to sell to teachers about their advances.
I greatly value questions like this. And to me, the most important part of the answer is that there is no answer yet to this question. We do not know what chatbots do well in the sense of do well and actually lead to more and better learning. Even with things like lesson plans, actually, Tori Trust at the University of Amherst has a study of civics lesson plans where she has humans rate AI lesson plans and human lesson plans, and they're like, the human lesson plans are way better. The Educational Endowment Fund in the UK did a study of lesson plans in elementary science where AI wrote some elementary science plans, teachers wrote some elementary science plans, and experts couldn't tell the difference between them. They were both equally good. So there's like one study that says lesson planning maybe works, one study that says lesson planning maybe doesn't work. But probably the most important thing about neither study actually teaches those lessons to kids and tracks their learning over a period of time to see whether or not they actually make a difference. And we have very, very few good studies, rigorous studies of introducing GPTs in the workflows of teachers and the learning flows of students in ways that are like realistic and reproducible and are kind of like what people are already out there doing, that show any kind of positive effects. One unfortunate piece of the sort of pattern in the research literature, my colleague Dan Meyer said something like, scratch at the surface of almost any study that shows that GPTs are benefiting learning, and you'll find that the people in the GPT condition get something more than just the AI. They get more time, they get more examples, they get more something else. There was a fun one, a colleague at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. If you all know Dora the Explorer, Dora does these like little 10-minute science videos, and they're actually like crazy effective at having people learn science. Like if you give a kid a quiz after watching a GBH science video, you're like, holy smokes, that kid learned a lot in 10 minutes. That's pretty cool. Dora, in the course of those videos, asks questions that nobody respond that Dora can't respond to because Dora can't hear the kid. So, a colleague at Harvard sort of programmed a version of something like Dora that could actually respond and interact with the kids. And when they do watch those videos with kind of like the enhanced AI character, the students do get a couple of more questions right than they would have in the control condition. But the videos take about 5 minutes longer. They take about twice as long to get through. So it's not really a comparison between an AI video and a regular video, it's a comparison between 10 minutes of learning and 15 minutes of learning. And a thing that we know for sure is that if you give people 150% more learning time, then they're going to make more progress. So there's lots of examples in the research literature that's about that. And yeah, so we would love to be able to tell Ferdy like these are the things that we're for sure know work, but there is literally nothing. There's literally nothing with GPTs that we know for sure works. And it's actually, I mean, here I'll give Ferdy more bad news. Google was founded in something like 1995. The first peer-reviewed paper with really strong evidence of how we should teach students to evaluate sources on the web was published in 2019. It was published about 25 years later. In between 1995 and 2019, we taught tens of millions of students provably incorrect ways to sort truth from fiction on the web. Like we miseducated tens of millions, multiple generations of students because research takes a long time. Like another way to frame the question is something like, if you're in a school and you want to experiment with AI, like what seems most promising to you? How would you test it in your own local context? And how would you evaluate whether or not it works? In the most simple way, like what's an assignment you've been doing for a while? What's a sort of AI version of that assignment? And when you look at the student work before and afterwards, do you see improved evidence of learning in the kinds of things that you care about? So we're not yet at a phase, I think, where educators should be looking for best practices because there aren't any best practices out there. We're at a phase where educators should be saying, like, what do we think would be productive experiments in our local context? But how can we do them not so willy-nilly? But how can we do them in a way that we can make like pretty good guesses about whether or not the things we're trying are really helping?
Justin, would you say that's our charge right now as educators? Like our charge is to just be creative, intentionally try it out and not be scared along the way because we
I,
just don't know. Is that the charge? Am
Yeah,
I
I think like these tools are weird. They do weird things. They're funny sometimes. There's a lot of we don't like the best computer scientists in the world can't explain to you exactly how they work. And that seems like a really rich place to play with young people. As you're deciding where to experiment and play, you might think a little bit about like what are parts of the curriculum that are more safe for experimentation and what are parts of the curriculum that you're like, we probably got to make sure we don't mess that part up. Jesse talked about this film class where it's like all film enthusiasts, and it's a, it's like it's an important part of. I don't want to devalue the part of the curriculum, but it's a part of the curriculum where it's resistant to experimentation. Like if an experiment doesn't work along a track of a film class, you're like, that's okay. If an experiment doesn't work in the middle of algebra, like if you mess up a quarter of algebra, that's no bueno for the kids like rest of their trajectory. I would play more with these kinds of things in senior English classes than I would in freshman English classes. So I think we can be strategic about the places in the curriculum to experiment more. And I think Jesse has this good point too that like it's just one of a series of challenges that schools have. That if there's things that you're doing really well, maybe that's actually the thing that you want to preserve. If there are things that you're doing really well and that you're not going to mess it up, maybe that's the place where you want to play. But definitely, it's not a time to be looking for outsiders or experts to tell you this is the way you should do things. It's the time to say nobody yet has the answers. And so we have to make some professional judgments in our own local environment and decide what kind of experiments we want to do and how we want to play and explore this thing. I don't know, Jesse, what were the things that you were most excited about for what's your version of that charge?
I mean, I agree with all of it. You definitely hear about some really neat experiments with AI. And I think one of the things is I think most schools will have teachers who want to experiment. And, so if you're a school leader, encouraging them, the teachers who have the energy and the capacity to do so, I think is great. And I think with Justin's admonition, let's have a conversation about what it looks like if this is a successful experiment or a failed experiment. A lot of teachers aren't doing that because they're sort of like, hey, this is really cool. We had a great teacher talk to us about his students using sort of vibe coding. This was before Claude Code. So this is like a year ago, vibe coding with Gemini and Chat GPT, Arduino Uno units to get them to play songs and things like that. Sounds great. And they are also, we think that they're learning principles of coding, and we think that software engineers in the future will probably be using some combination of AI and their domain knowledge. But it's untested. So I guess the final point, I wanted to make is that there are those experiments happening, but they're often happening without that assessment piece because teachers are really, really busy and administrators are really, really busy. And so making an effort to say, hey, those of you who are really excited to play around with AI and try some things, let's talk for a half hour about what it would look like if it worked, and let's talk about how we might try to capture that or if you're a new teacher and you want to experiment, you can even just go through a mental process yourself. What would it look like if this worked? What results would I see that are different from what I'm seeing right now? What would I consider to be evidence to worth that tells me I need to keep doing this or that I need to make some kind of change? And just going through that process, like in the car or driving home or something like that, I think would be very useful.
Thank you all so much. I know we're at time. What a wonderful conversation. Justin and Jesse, I just can't thank you enough for joining us today. We really learned a lot. And just thank you for the work you're doing. Y'all, if you haven't listened to the Homework Machine, go find it on your local media player and download it. It's a great listen to hear from teachers and students and how they're looking at AI in depth. Also, we put in the links to Justin's books as well as some other resources in the chat. So please do take a look at those. Lastly, if we are not connected on any of those social media platforms, please do find us on there. You can see our upcoming events. We do have a special webinar coming up next Thursday around the Math Narratives Project. So please do join us. You can learn more about the math narratives and some tools to be able to enact those in your own context. And then we also have our final nuts and bolts webinar where we'll have teachers reflect on this series, which is always a fun and interesting way to end the series. So please join us as we hear from those teachers. And lastly, if you can take that poll before you pop off. Again, thank you so much, Justin and Jesse, for joining us here today. I know we all enjoyed learning from you and hearing from you and feel inspired that we can go try out AI with not fear of judgment, but a curiosity in spirit and thinking about how to do that intentionally. So thank you all so much for today. We will see everyone at our next upcoming event. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.